Well, hi everyone. Here we are for episode 22. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. This has been a long series, but people are fascinated by it. I know they just love listening to you and getting all this information. Of course, it'll be in a book in 2021 that you're doing the research for right now. So this is episode 22, episode 23 next week, and then episode 24. 23 will be the final wrap up, actually. And then 24, you're going to answer questions. So if people want to put their questions in the comments, you will collate those questions and then do your best to answer them. And also, we're going to use a different program so that we could have some live questions. We hope, if all goes well. So this particular program, 22, Searching for the Earliest Clues of Human History, Who Are Abraham's Biological Descendants? Well, that's going to be very interesting. So can the DNA tell us what happened after the events of the Tower of Babel, but before the famine in Joseph's day? And you're going to be looking at the earliest days of human history. This is going to be fascinating. So Dr. Jeanson, over to you.
And I want to reiterate the point about the Q&A session. I know we've got some viewers in different time zones in Europe and Australia and so forth who may not be able to make the live. So please avail yourself of the comment section in this video. If you forget this one, maybe 23, put it in there, we'll collect them. If you have a question, there's a good chance someone else does as well. We want to hit those, we want to answer them. And we'll start with those, the written in questions, and then deal with the live ones as they come in. So
and
please avail yourself of that. Yeah.
I might just mention too, Nathaniel, to remind people, they can see the whole series on answers.tv. It's our streaming service that you can subscribe to from any country in the world. You can subscribe to answers.tv, just over $3 US a month, which is very inexpensive. And you can also get them on YouTube, but answers.tv is really high quality. And so they can go and watch the entire series. And on answers.tv, we have over 1,700 items right now of various videos and programs, teaching programs and other programs and nature programs from a creationist perspective, and some of the material from Ray Comfort from Living Waters, and Spanish material. We're putting up Arabic material very soon, a whole range of materials there. So, okay, tell us about Abraham.
Yes, and if they've been watching Answers TV or YouTube, you asked a question before, didn't get answered, just ask it again. Some of the questions I've put pause on answering just because the series has kept going, and so I knew some of them would be answered, but maybe it hasn't been. So avail yourself of this opportunity. We're now again at the ancient stages of human history. We've been moving from the present backwards in time, looking at the connections among living peoples, as well as the questions among the ancients and those of us who've made it till this day. We saw in episode 20 some neglected clues to biblical history. I say neglected because I've missed them for many years and had to have my own thinking sanctified by the scriptures. And we've seen that when we think about human history, creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, that gets us to Babel. And there seems to have been a second Babel-like event. That's how it appears to me at this point, textually. At the time of Joseph's day, the famine where it says all the earth 4 times came to Egypt to survive. And then we've seen in the history of Israel, there's been conquest. And to me, this just stems from the depravity of the human heart. Conquest is the rule throughout history. We saw it before the flood, after the flood. I don't know that there's any point in human history where this is not playing a role. And this is something to keep in mind all the time as we think about the history. So we have Babel, and we rightly view this as the initial impetus for the formation of the major ethno-linguistic groups, or so-called races around the globe. We're all just various shades of brown. And we've thought about this being the impetus for people eventually getting to the Americas. The question we've asked and debated is, if there's a second Babel-like event in the time of Joseph's day, some, I think, have struggled with the question of, well, what if they're in the Americas? How can you make it back to Egypt for Joseph's day? The question I want to raise again is, were there people in the Americas? These are some of the things we're going to get at in today's episode, because there's several centuries between the Tower of Babel. So I'm putting it shortly after the flood, maybe 100 years, 150 years after the flood. The famine is 600 to 700 years after the flood. Abraham is squarely in between these two, what happened? Or to put it in the context maybe of the schooling you and I have grown up with, I grew up learning creationist material, learning about creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, the Tower of Babel. But in my mind, still there was a disconnect. Yes, there were these biblical events, but then civilization started. Ancient Sumer. I had Christian history textbooks. We started with that. And I did not have a good sense for how exactly those biblical events connected to what we saw there. And in general, I think I mentioned this in episode 1, history has been a puzzle of where do these people come from? What happens to them? It seems like civilizations pop out of nowhere and disappear into nothing. And there's no explanation for that. Well, genetics is the key to understanding all this. And we've been exploring these clues from the present working backwards in previous episodes, because we're now on episode 22. And we have all these on YouTube and especially on Answers TV. I'm not going to review all these from episodes 1 through 21, where we discuss Europe, Africa, Pacific, pre-Columbian Americas, the whole 9 yards in these previous episodes. You can find those there. Now we want to get back to the earliest stages of human history and try to make these connections. And what we've seen, especially in the most recent episodes, 20 and 21, is that we have 2 major tools by which we can interrogate this stage of history. We've been looking heavily at the tree itself. And so the major tool that has been the basis for virtually all of our discussions of human history has been the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. It's a section of our DNA in males that shows differences and similarities among people around the globe. The basis for these differences is the imperfect inheritance of it. We live in a fallen world. Mistakes happen. Biology doesn't happen perfectly as God originally intended. It's a cursed creation because of mankind's sin. And so each generation, on average now, 2 to 3 mistakes happen as the Y chromosome is copied. So these add up over time, and they're a reflection of how recently or distantly in the past you and I have common ancestors. If Ken and I have a recent common ancestor, this will be reflected in our Y chromosome differences. There'll be few of them. If he and I, for some reason, even though we're both of ultimately European descent, have a distant male common ancestor, we will have many Y chromosome differences between us. That's a principle that's true globally, and so we can use the global Y chromosome family tree to reconstruct human history and see the connections and isolation among people groups around the globe. And we've seen a whole bunch of shocking discoveries about events that have happened in human history ever since the beginning. Now we're going to look at these earliest clues. So that's one clue, this Y chromosome tree. The second clue that we saw last episode, it gets into a little bit of complicated math. We saw the ramifications of it. Genetics itself gives us a means by which we can convert mainstream scientific dates to calendar dates, young Earth ones. So we want to employ both of those today, heavily the latter, to look at the earliest stages of human history. Mainstream textbooks, when they talk about the development of human civilization, will often point to agriculture as the first step. To get a group of people over which you can have a ruler who enacts laws, maybe as a dictator or whatever, you need a sufficient population size over which to rule. And to get a sufficient population size, you need to feed them. To feed them, you have to have agriculture. So there's the dominoes, going backwards, that are needed in mainstream science for civilization to arise. So I'm going to take now from a mainstream textbook that we have here on staff in our library. I'm going to take that and point out the mainstream dates for these origins of agriculture. And if you've got a different textbook and different year for the textbook, you might get different dates. It changes in mainstream science. So this is just going with what I have on hand. They would put the first evidence for agriculture, first major agricultural site, 9000 BC, mainstream scientific date, in ancient Mesopotamia. And then 2,000 years later, in their time scale, China and Papua New Guinea, evidence for agriculture. And then later, several thousand years later, you have evidence for agriculture in West Africa and in the Americas. Now, episode 21, last episode, we looked at this 4-step process by which we can convert these dates to calendar dates, and the link are these population sizes. Evolutionists have ideas, claims on how many people were alive at various points in their evolutionary history. We've looked at the population sizes we can infer from archaeology and that are reflected in the Y chromosome tree. We can use all that to convert these to dates. And if you want to see the specific steps, you can go back and look at episode 21. This is the graph that results. And again, I want to point out the salient features of it so that we're all on the same page. These tan lines over here represent the range of flood dates, the average here in the solid line, the range in the dotted lines, and again, the slight variation, and it isn't much. We're talking about maybe 100 years on this side, 100 years on that side. Comes from small uncertainties in the text. Some are as simple as, okay, Abraham was this old when he had this son. Was that a week before his birthday, a week after his birthday? How precise can you be about that exact year? And if you do that over 100 generations, now you've got 100-year uncertainty. It's not that hard for these sorts of things to show up. They have nothing to do with trying to synthesize evolution with the text or with older timescale with the text. Just don't want to be more precise than what the text is given our current understanding. So there's the range of dates for the flood. And again, what I'm showing you here is based on the Masoretic text and a long sojourn in Egypt. If you're a Septuagint person or a short sojourn, you would get a slightly shifted graph. This is just where I'm coming from. As a minister, we haven't entered into that debate. These lines right here represent the date for Joseph's famine. The average right here around 1900 BC with the ranges, about maybe 50 years on either side of it. And then the key part of this are these blue lines by which we can convert evolutionary dates on this axis to calendar dates on this axis. And there's two blue lines to represent sort of the bookends, the range of dates based, again, due to some of these small uncertainties in the text, and perhaps the bigger contributing factor being the statistical uncertainty that's always inherent in biological measurements. So on this axis, you have the evolutionary BC dates. I gave them as positive numbers. Here are the BC dates. The calendar dates in the young Earth timescale are negative numbers. Why would I do that? Because it makes the graph easier to see. So don't be confused by the negative positive, BC, BC. And I'll show you with some examples here exactly how this works. That'll probably be easier to understand that way. So back to the mainstream timescale for these origins of agriculture, beginning with this 9000 BC date for Mesopotamia. Let's go to our graph, and I'm going to show you how this conversion works. You go to this axis, the evolutionary date, find 9000 BC, and draw a horizontal line over until you run into one of these two lines. We ran into this one right here. You draw a vertical line down. It tells you, okay, this represents a date of somewhere between 2200 and 2100 BC. Do it for that second line. Draw it over until you hit the second line so we can get the full range. This is somewhere between 1900 and 2000. Again, you draw it over until it bumps into this blue line. And at that point, you draw a vertical line down. Now you've got your dates. So there's the range. The first one bumps in there, second one there. The average is this thicker pinkish purple line right there. So what I'm showing you is a mainstream date of 9000 BC represents a calendar date of roughly 2000-ish. And again, these numbers will change as we get more biological data. And this is just a very first pass preliminary attempt at getting a sense for how this may turn out. That's our first converted date. Now let's do the 7000 BC. Mainstream science, okay, thousands of years separate this. How many calendar years actually separate this? Find 7000 over here, draw the line over to the blue line. Once you hit it, draw it down between 2100 and 2200. Do the same thing for that second blue line. So you get the bookends of it, 1900 to 2000. Then you get about the average, and the average is about the same as for 9000 BC. So they're claiming a gap of 2 millennia when the gap is 50 years. Maybe it's overlapping. It's about the same. Now the 3000 BC dates. Oh, this must be many millennia after the first agriculture in Mesopotamia. Well, is it? 3000 BC, they say, draw it over until it bumps into the line here, draw it down between 2000 and 2100 again. Draw it over this way. Now it's between 1600 and 1700. The average comes out to around 1850 or so. Not that far off, a century or two from these. And again, there's some uncertainty, so these may actually all overlap. The evolutionists say, oh, it took millennia for these cultures to evolve. Well, we've got advanced cultures before the flood. We've got shipbuilding before the flood, advanced cultures building a tower after the flood. Why wouldn't agriculture just, boom, pop up right away? People know how to do this. It may take them a little bit of time to spread out, but it seems to happen in short order. So let me make another point here. Again, if there's some concern about, well, how do you get people in the Americas back to the famine? Let's say there are people in the Americas before the famine of Joseph. They're getting there pretty fast. They have technology by which they can get there. And if they can get there pretty fast, what's to stop them from returning very fast? Something to keep in mind. But let's dig a little deeper here. There's another point in this map that I think is significant. Those are the average dates for agriculture. And you can see the ranges of these pinkish purple lines here. And again, the end, this most advanced date for the 9000 BC conversion bleeds into the dates for Joseph's famine. 7000 BC, the range of dates from this line, pink line, to this line, begins to bleed into the day range of dates for Joseph's famine. And these dates, 3000 BC, definitely is smack in the middle of Joseph's famine. If we use the average date for the famine, the average dates for these conversions, agriculture may not have been in the Americas until after Joseph's famine. So this itself says any concerns about, well, how do you get these people back to Egypt? They may not have been in Egypt based on the conversion of these dates. What does agriculture represent, though? It means someone is there tilling the fields. Well, how many people were there tilling the fields? What's the evidence for that? Could it have been one or a few families going from place to place? Again, the mainstream timescale we've been taught has stuff separated by millennia. And so we intuitively think, oh, maybe this was a group of people and it's taken a long period of time. No, if this is all roughly contemporary and these dates are all needing to be converted, it could have been, we do a field here and then we plant a field here and then we go down here. It's a very different way of thinking about it once you convert these dates. There's a lot of ramifications for this. But I want to move on from this temporarily because I think there's an even better readout for understanding the movement of peoples, and that's the formation of states. Again, basically by definition, if you're going to have a state, a civilization like Egypt, Sumer, the Indus River Valley, Minoans, Mycenaeans, and the Greek and the Aegean, you need enough people there to have a ruler over them. Perhaps a better readout of movements of groups of peoples instead of perhaps some in isolation. Here's again the mainstream dates from this textbook we have, and you might have slightly different dates depending on your textbook and source, because they change in mainstream science. Sumer, in this textbook, gets a date of 3500 BC. States again, not agriculture, state formation, organized society. The earliest civilizations on the Greek Balkan Peninsula, 3200, Egypt, 3000, Indus River Valley, 2500, Yellow River Valley, cradle of civilization, and that's what these represent here, these green places, the cradles of civilization, 2000, and the Olmecs, sometimes they're given in 1900, this one says 1500 for their state formation. Let's convert these. I'm not going to do each individual one. I'm just going to be using that same method, using this graph, and here's the result. Here's the dates for these states. And again, the key point by which we want to compare is the famine. So I find this fascinating. Again, very preliminary research in progress may change, but given what we have now, this suggests that the only civilizations around at the time of Joseph were in close geographic proximity to Egypt. How hard can it be to get back there? And those civilizations at more distant regions, and you can notice there's a progression in time, later, latest, or a little bit later, even more late, the latest, are at the distance from Egypt. These civilizations in red all seem to be post-famine. There may not have been people of any significance, I should say of any significant numbers, in the Americas until after Joseph's famine. So if you're considering, well, I don't know what to do with those verses, and I realize even conservative commentators may not have gone that direction. I mean, I grew up in a conservative home and I didn't hear much discussion. I didn't grow up dwelling on the global extent of the famine of Joseph. It's just not a big point of debate usually, especially in the origins debate. When we have to dig into the details of human history now, it becomes relevant. It's forced me to go back and say, well, what is it exactly saying? I've given some arguments in episode 24 why I think it's global. I'm not claiming that this is the hill to die on. I think there's some good arguments for us to consider. And I don't see good counter arguments yet for it. Now, again, the strong message of Answers in Genesis is one of biblical authority. So I'm immediately skeptical when people say, well, you need to change your Bible interpretation because science. We should all be concerned about that and sanctify our thinking and say, no, what does the Bible say? And you take that to science. I've done this for years in biology. I've been concerned by how many people I've run into who seem to not apply that rule when it comes to archaeology. Why wouldn't we? Archaeology, does anyone think archaeology is not a worldview constrained discipline? Hopefully you've seen here, it is. And the dates you derive are based on what you say about the scriptures. I think part of the reason it hasn't gained as much prominence is because the stakes don't seem as high. If you're in biology, you're an evolutionist, and you hold an old-time skill, or you're a creationist. It's pretty black and white. There isn't much middle ground. Old Earth creationists have tried to stake some out, but that's becoming increasingly hard to do, especially in genetics. Geology, you hold to billions of years. Astronomy, billions of years, or it's 6,000. There are very, very little middle ground, and you have to make a choice. In archaeology, if it's, well, you're 6,000 or 10,000, the stakes aren't quite as high. And I think it's, and I say this as someone who's a sinner and in need of sanctification, we all are. To me, I think I can see it being easier to not be forced to think about these issues. I think it's time we do. Let's take a good look at archaeology through the lens of Scripture and apply the biblical worldview to this. And I think when we do, some of the objections people might raise disappear because the dates change. That's one tool, converting dates. The second tool I mentioned is the human family tree. What does the family tree say about these earliest civilizations, beginning with ancient Egypt? In the 1,000 Genomes Project that we've looked at multiple times before in previous episodes, this is the project that sampled the places in the globe where the people are. Not necessarily a comprehensive geographic sampling of the globe, of the political realms, but of where the people are. There's multiple African or African descent populations. Southwest United States, Oklahoma. There's some African descent peoples in Barbados they sampled, and there's 5 in sub-Saharan Africa, several in West Africa, and 1 in Kenya. And we talked about those lineages being present down here on the tree. Those include the longer ones, the longer branches, in which I argued and have evidence for the clock ticking slightly faster there. It's not them mutating into the future. It's just their clock ticks slightly differently, and this has all been accounted for in our calculations. In episode 19, we talked about the history of Africa and the major branches present there. I said there were 6 right now. And again, these are ugly labels. Scientists give ugly labels, but they give functional ones. Major letters of the alphabet for the major divisions, and then you assign a number if it gets subdivided. And I'll show you more how this works in a minute as we zoom in here. The question we're trying to answer is, where's Egypt? Where's ancient Egypt? Is there an ancient Egyptian civilization? I'm saying Noah is back here. We've zoomed in a little bit more now. I'm not going to show you each individual person. I want you to show you the big structure, big picture structure. The first several centuries are this line right here. Then the famine hits, and then the diversification happens. Well, the first lineages that branch off are A and B. These are, again, the Click-speaking peoples of Southwest Africa, the Khoisan, the Bushmen, and some of the Sudanese, very dark-skinned, tall peoples, the Nilo-Saharan speakers, as well as the Maasai of Kenya. They're the closest to the famine and to the origins of ancient Egypt, given the dates we've just looked at. You might notice here and say, wait a minute, that's a blue lineage. What's that doing in the middle of Africa? That is group D. We looked at this in episode 16. That's, I think, about 1/3 of Japan, plus the peoples of the Great Andamanese Islands. Those peoples are very dark-skinned. Right? What in the world is a Japanese lineage in the middle of Africa? This is part of the reason why I argued in episode 16 why I think some of the Japanese may have African roots. They're in the middle of all these other African lineages. This seems to have been, and again, the Great Andamanese peoples break off around 800 BC. Makes me wonder if there was some migration out of Africa, stop in the Andamanese Islands, eventually to Japan, and then other Asian peoples came in, and that's why the Japanese look like they do today, because the most recent peoples coming to Japan were Asian, East Asians, not Africans. But I'll leave that there for the moment. Now you can see part of the reason why it's worth thinking about whether or not there are African connections to Japan that no one has discussed before. E2 shows up here. We didn't discuss E2 or E1A because they just represent a fraction of Africa. The major lineages in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are E1, B1B. This was the North African one. This is the major West and Central African one, E1, B1A. Together, these lineages represent 95% of Sub-Saharan Africa. West Africa and Central Africa heavily. And Japan is between these groups. So again, that's something intriguing to think about. D and E split about 1700 BC. Could this be aftermath of the famine? If it's in 1900, people kind of trickle out from Egypt? Maybe, I don't know. But it's worth keeping in mind as research goes forward. Where's the ancient Egyptians? A and B are closest to the origin of this civilization. Are these the early Egyptians? I've been to the Ashmolean Museum in the UK, where they've got one of the oldest, based on mainstream dates, Egyptian statues on record. And I'm struck by, he's from the second dynasty, one of the earliest Egyptian dynasties. I'm struck by how his features, his cheekbones, the shape of his eyes, and his lips remind me of the Khoisan, the Bushman peoples, who have Asian-looking eyes, high cheekbones, and their facial features seem to have matched. Makes me wonder if the earliest Egyptians were these Khoisan peoples. And we know from Egyptian history that there's been tumult, and there's been invasions of Egyptians, and Nubians were an Egyptian dynasty, and Persians and Greeks were later. There's all sorts of other people in Egypt. This would be consistent with other people. How would we know for sure, though? For that matter, how would we find out who the first Middle Easterners were, the Sumerians, and eventually the Assyrians, and after them the Babylonians and Persians? What about the first Americans? That was a question we raised but did not answer in episode 16. Also in episode 16, we speculated on the possibility of the first Americans being dark-skinned peoples, related to perhaps sub-Saharan Africans or Southeast Asian, Australian Aborigines, Papua New Guinean, Pacific peoples. We noticed that there's a bunch of dark-skinned peoples with deep lineages within a similar latitude, and we wondered if we extended that latitude range eastward, if these peoples could have gone over to the Americas. Episode 18, we asked the question of what is the original Jewish lineage? The popular one, based on the mainstream timescale, can't be it. It doesn't seem to be it, at least. The dates they're giving for it can't be. There's multiple lineages among Jews today. Are one of the ones among Jews today the originals? Is this Abraham's DNA? Abraham is within this range of the earliest history between Babel, flood, famine. Episode 19, we left the question dangling of the origin of the major North African, South African peoples. We saw that they were joined in 500 BC. They split. I argued that this E1B1B appears to have been the Arab Muslims who then conquered North Africa. This becomes much of sub-Saharan Africa. Geographically, they seem to connect through ancient Egypt. And this is around the time, within a century, of the Nubian dynasty in Egypt. So what was going on there? How do we find the answers to these questions? And of course, there's the question of what happened in this mysterious section of history from flood to famine, the time of Abraham, in which all we have right now are two branches, which of course raises the other question that we didn't answer. What about the three boys of Noah? We began to think about this in a little bit more depth last episode, where I said, even based on Genesis 10, you've got Shem and Ham, each having twice as many descendants as Japheth. They seem to be reproducing faster. And if that continued, it could be that mathematically his lineages were outcompeted very quickly. And of course, you have the verse in Genesis 9 talking about Japheth dwelling in the tents of Shem. Is that a hint at Japheth's lineage becoming a minority over time and hard to detect? To get the answers to these questions, we need to examine and revisit an element of this graph that we haven't looked at before. There's something still hidden in this graph that I want to now bring to our attention. It's mathematical in nature, involves a little bit of algebra, but don't let that intimidate you. We'll walk through these examples slowly. And this is critical and leads us to a very intriguing answer. So let's break apart this graph into its component parts. We've got two lines, I should say. We've got tan lines, we've got blue lines, both of them sharing the same x-axis, which represents calendar years. The blue line, these two blue lines represent, based on archaeology and historical records, the number of people alive at these points in time. And I've shown you on this y-axis the numbers of males. So you can say, okay, at 1800 AD, there were 400 million people. And if we go back to 800 AD, there were 100 to 200 million. And that's how you read it. This was superimposed on the reconstruction of human population growth based on the Y chromosome. Same x-axis, years, but a different y-axis, a very different scale. These numbers represent the number of branches on this family tree. So this took a sample of about 323 men from around the globe, which is why it ends between 300 and 350. That's this axis in tan. Now, why in the world would we superimpose the number of branches from just 300 men on a history of humanity that has hundreds of millions of men? There's a relationship here that is implied that I now want to dig into deeper. And then we're going to do it in steps. Do it in steps. So track with me each step. I want to draw a horizontal line right here. It intersects this y-axis. It intersects this y-axis. And you'll notice here that the blue line is right on top of the yellow line at this point. We can draw a vertical line down. This represents the time period in history of AD 1800, roughly. And at this point in history, there were about 400 million men. And you can see that's reflected in roughly 225 branches. Well, that doesn't match. What in the world is going on here? Well, let's draw another line. This is where the relationship will become more clear. I want to take a time point of roughly 400 to 500 BC. That's what the negative numbers represent. 400 to 500 BC, we're at this point where the blue and the tan overlap. That represents 25, 30 branches over there. If we extend this line this direction, it represents 60 million men alive in the globe. Okay, all we're doing now is just reading pieces of the graph and making them explicit. And this is where we're going to see the relationship. So up here, this line on this side intersects about 225. On this side, it intersects about 400 million. And if you look at this reddish looking line, over here it intersects about around 30. And over here it intersects about 60. Why do I bring this up? The hidden clue to human history in this graph is a multiplicative relationship, not one of addition and subtraction, but of multiplication and division. This is what I mean. This number is a far cry from this number. This number is a far cry from this number. 30 is not 60 million. Well, there's a relationship where there is a match. And this is what I mean. I want to look at the relationship between these two respective numbers, which represent different time points. This is the 1800 AD time point. This is the 500 AD time point. This is the 1800 AD time point, 500 AD time point for the Y chromosome, for the absolute numbers of men. Now let's do some multiplication and division. 225 divided by 30 gives you a result of 7.5. 400 million divided by 60 million gives you a number that's very close. You round this up to 7 or 8, you round this up to around 7. That's really close. This multiplicative relationship between points in time is reflecting the Y chromosome tree. Well, they're not exact, yeah, but think about it. We've taken 300 men and reconstructed thousands of years of human history, and the match is that tight. This is not necessarily something, a sort of math problem you set out to solve. I want you to see this is something we can empirically see. Let's take another time point. This time, we'll go back to around the time of the famine of Joseph. So 500, 600, 700 years post-flood. How many people were alive back then? What's the multiplicative relationships? You almost can't even see that reddish line because it's so close to this x-axis. It's such ancient history. These are the number of branches back then and the number of people back then. We talked about this last episode, 5 to 10 million men alive at the time of Joseph. Now, do the multiplication and division. 225 divided by 3 is what? 400 million divided by 5.5 is what? What are the ratios? They're very close to each other, 75 and 73. That's what's reflected in these blue lines overlapping the tan lines. There's a reflection here. You do the multiplication and division and you can see a match. So, okay, well, this is a lot of math for a biological discussion. The point I'm driving at here is, as you take time points on the tree, you see matches, and the strong matches allow you to make predictions. So even if you're not following each of these steps, my point is, I can use these mathematical relationships to make predictions. Watch how this works. What if we go back to 2200 BC, pre-famine? Now we're in the time period between flood, and I'd say Babel, and famine. We can draw a line. We can read off the number of people in history, 44,000. This is based somewhat on the calculations that I did in the past episode about going from 4 males to 5 to 10 million. It's a rough estimate. We can get a mathematical relationship. So what this says is to go from 44,000 people, which is just a fraction of a million, 0.044 million, to 400 million people, you have to undergo a 9,000-fold increase in population size. There's been a huge increase in the number of people on the planet from 2200 BC to 1800 AD. At this point in the tree, we really don't have any branches to speak of by which we can understand human population growth. This is now closer to the point I'm trying to make. But I know, because these are always matching, that this is going to, whatever 225 is divided by is going to give you a number that's close to this. I know that because of the 2 examples I just showed you, there's a match. These 2 lines match, and so I can use them to inform each other and make predictions. So I can do a little bit of algebra, solve for the question mark. You don't have to know algebra, I'll do it for you. What this predicts then is, in 2200 BC, we should see 0.02 branches on our family tree. What's a 0.02 branch? It's meaningless. You don't give birth to 2/100ths of a person. It means you just wouldn't see hardly any branches at all. You can also flip the math around and say, okay, if we want to see 2 branches on our family tree, or 3 branches, whatever you want, at 2200 BC, how many men do you have to sample? This is the biggest point I'm driving at. We can use this graph to make predictions. And one of the key prediction I'm trying to show you here is, how many men do we have to sample to get at the most ancient time points in history? That's what this graph allows us to do. You do the algebra, solve for the purple question mark. What this says is, to find 2200 BC, just a few branches, you have to sample 18,000 men, which of course is going to change that number right there. It's not going to be 225, and it's going to change the values on this axis. Even if you didn't follow all that, this is the point I was trying to prove to you. We have sampled 300 men, and it's allowed us to get at a section of human history, thousands of years of human history. But because the number of branches on the family tree has gone from 4, Noah and his 3 boys, to nearly 4 billion, there's a huge sampling question we have to address. How many men do we have to sample to have any hope of having more ancient branches? The branches that could tell us who the ancient Egyptians were, and who the ancient Persians were, and the Assyrians, and the people in the Indus River Valley, and China, and so on and so forth. What would it take to find the branches at Babel, close to it, or shortly thereafter? There's 70 men listed in Babel. My guess is those are the heads of families. They may have had sons themselves. They're going to multiply. They multiplied. They had an average of 7 to 8 kids per couple in Genesis 10, is what it implies. And if they kept reproducing that fast, you're going to get to 1,000 pretty quick. Let's do the math to find out how many men we have to sample today to have a mathematical chance of getting close to these original men at Babel, these lineages. Well, 1,000 is just a fraction of a million. So 400 million divided by a fraction of a million is a 400,000-fold change. It's a multiplication factor. You multiply 1,000 by 400,000, you get 4 million. We've undergone a 400,000-fold increase in male population size since that time, which is, I'm saying, roughly 2400 BC. Well, how many men do we have to sample today to see just 2 of those 1,000 branches? You do the math, the algebra, you need to sample 800,000 men. It's of course going to change that number, it's going to change the axis. My big point is this. Why do we only have 2 branches at these earliest stages, which may be Shem and Ham, and will not have Japheth? My point is not that these lineages, Japheth's lineages, necessarily go extinct. That could be true. My point is, especially given that the slow start he had in Genesis 10, is we simply may not have sampled enough people yet to see it. Japheth's lineage, or whoever this lineage is. So if Noah is where I think he is, and it's still a question of debate, but if he is where I think he is, based on the 300 men we've sampled, Japheth's lineage may still be out there, running around the globe today. We just haven't sampled it yet. And the math that I've just shown you gives us a prediction, a rule of thumb by which we can say, okay, here's how many men we need to sample to get to that point in history. And the math I just showed you gives us the way forward to answer all these other unanswered questions. My prediction is there still is a lineage of the first Americans running around somewhere in the Americas today. Maybe they got wiped out. Maybe they went extinct. I mean, today's Native Americans, the people who came in the AD era, see those previous episodes for the explanation, maybe they did wipe all of them out. But my guess is there may still be an ancient lineage running around the Americas, and if you sample enough Native Americans today, you might find it. And that'll answer our question. What about the ancient Egyptians? Sample enough people today, and you might find it. Same thing with the Assyrians, the Babylonians. To get at the earliest points in human history, Abraham's DNA, you have to sample millions of men. So what that means is this new history that we're uncovering is the beginning of the search. And what I've shown you are the initial results. And with 300 men in this main study and total around the globe, if you go searching the scientific literature and say how many men have had their complete Y chromosome sequence by which we can reconstruct the family tree, I think it's under 5,000. So that's remarkable. Under 5,000 men, and we've learned this much about history. How much more is waiting to be unlocked as we sequence more Y chromosomes from more men, which means you and me and everyone else around the globe. So this may be sort of a disappointing conclusion to all this. It implies there's a sequel coming, and indeed there is. As we sequence more Y chromosomes, more of these answers are coming in. But what we've seen is that the key to finding these answers is the 4,500-year timescale. The hero of the plot, in this case, is the biblical timescale. You don't find these answers if you adopt the evolutionary timescale. And we've had ridiculous amounts of success already finding the answers to more recent questions. What is a European? What happened to the Magyars? What happened to the Vikings? The Turkish peoples? The Chinese? So forth. How much more successful we have going forward as we sequence more men. What we're going to do next time is put all these clues together, because there are more answers, suggestions, hypotheses that emerge when you walk through history from start to finish with the Y chromosome and the history of human population growth in hand. And we'll hope to discover those next time in the new history of the human race. I hope you'll join us. And again, I hope you'll write your questions in the comment section of this episode. Again, if you wrote a question last time, previous episode was never answered, put it down again. I'll be looking at these, collecting them, so that for episode 24, so US Eastern time, it'll be Sunday evening, June 14th, we'll have a live Q&A, but we'll also address these pre-written questions. So especially if you cannot join us live and you've had a burning question, please write these down. I'll be collecting them and we'll be answering them then.
Well, thanks, Dr. Jeanson. You know, I was just thinking, because people are so indoctrinated in, you know, the millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years, and just the secular timescale of things, even for the ancient civilizations and the way they date them and so on. I think, you know, people have this idea, even Christians, that, you know, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Egyptians, they're just so far removed. You know, they're just ancient cultures we don't understand. But this brings it all together. Actually, when you read the Bible, if you just take it as written, it brings it all together to say they're not far removed from us at all. And their genes are still running around here in various places. And it makes you realize that, hey, it's very different to what we thought. And it's absolutely fascinating, and fascinating to see the research that you're doing when you take the Bible seriously, and then you're doing good observational science, genetics research, Y chromosome, and bringing those together. It just is another one of those confirmations that, you know, God's word is true, and we need to take that history seriously there. So what are you doing in the next episode? And then we'll follow with the question time in the following episode. So we just had 21, 22, and then next week will be 23, 24. 23, the final episode of teaching. 24 is the question time. People can put their questions in the comments on this program or the next one. And we're also going to use a different system so we can actually have live questions as well for number 24. So what's number 23?
I'm calling 23 the hidden history of the world, because we're going to take what we've discussed and put it all together. This doesn't mean it's a strict review. I began to put the presentation together and I started looking at what was emerging. I thought, no way, this is crazy. And you might get a sense for what we're going to do from thinking of the episodes and the questions we did not answer. So for example, I talked about the history of the Jews, and we looked at the history of the Middle East recently. Seems to be Turkish influence. History of the Turks is that they arose in Central Asia in 600 AD, roughly. Well, people don't just pop into existence. God wasn't creating Adam again from the dust in 600 AD. They came from someone. We never addressed the question of who they came from. And so as you begin to line up the tree, so I basically started that story by saying, where are these people today, and what were the movements from 600 AD onward? Next time we can take some of these lineages and say, okay, let's take that J backwards. Where is it? Who do they come from? Who are their ancestors? How do they connect to Europe? And once you start putting all the pieces together and addressing the entire tree, there's some really crazy stuff that begins to emerge that blows my mind, and I think will blow our viewers' minds in a way they never expected.
Well, that's going to be very interesting as we look forward to that final teaching episode. And then the final episode, episode 24, will be the question and answer episode. So people can go to answers.tv, our streaming service. You can get a 7-day free trial, but it's only just over $3 US a month. And you can watch all the episodes, and they're really high quality on answers.tv, much higher quality than YouTube, but you can go to YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, and we'll have a playlist there with Dr. Jeanson's program there as well. And so, Dr. Jeanson, thanks for another fascinating look at, this is all groundbreaking research. Nobody will ever hear this anywhere else, actually. I mean, this is very unique, and thankful for you and your research. And well, maybe it's one of those positive aspects of COVID-19. So you're stuck at home and locked in a room, and that's what you did. But anyway, okay, we'll look forward to seeing you in episode 23. Don't forget to put your questions that you have in the comments here for episode 24.